And Bobby, I know for you, when I watch your stuff, you're always, talking at such a high level. But in a way, it's easy for the athletes to understand too. So Kevin, from an athlete's perspective, you've worked with Bobby. For the athletes out there, what do you see as the greatest benefit from having Bobby's information on tap for you?
Well, as an athlete, having Bobby there with you is obviously the best thing that you can have. I mean, it's like having him there. I always want to have my notebook around so I can take notes. Uh, because, like, I mean, if he'll say 100 things during the session, and I'll try and remember all of them, but I never do. Uh, but having the run transformation course online, it's sort of like having him there with you. It's everything that Bobby McGee would teach you about running, but it's all kind of been uh, boiled down into the one easy to follow course. Uh, so yeah, I think it's kind of like having him there with you.
All right. Great. And Bobby, let me move on to the question. I think you had a huge answer to a very controversial question. A lot of triathletes, I think, have come into the world of running with knowledge of the pose method or some other form of running, and people are obsessed with the forward lean. And you had a question about that, about forward lean. What would you say to that? Because that was a very interesting answer the other night after the broadcast was cut off on the live version.
Not being the brightest guy around and not being a guy that is deeply involved in research and so on. My job in life has really been to carry over reasonably complex concepts so that people can practically use them, and I think we all get our various gifts, and I think that's what I've been blessed with, is the ability to carry over some of these concepts so that people can actually practically apply them. And so when it comes to the forward lean, it's such a multifaceted answer. It's very fascinating to me. So right at its basis is the effects of gravity. So if your shoulders are being carried while you run significantly behind your contact point, in other words, your center of mass is positioned behind your pivot point, then it is obviously creating more braking. You are leaning backwards, so you're coming into the ground almost like a pole vault pole, and you're leaning back and sticking it into the ground. So the closer you can get that pole vault pole to upright, the quicker it will flip over forward. So it's just like leaning on a downhill. So humans are tall and narrow. So if you put a stick on a slope, the stick would fall down the slope. And so that's the principle that we're trying to use. But the athlete needs to be balanced, and we also don't want the athlete falling on their face, and they have to put a foot out in front of them to stop them from doing that. So what I actually teach is obviously the thing that all of these principles teaches is that you need to lean from the ankles. All right, and we find that heel strikers need to lean a little bit more than midfoot strikers. Midfoot strikers tend to be a little bit more upright. But to me, the whole issue lies with the connection between the pelvis and the chest. So if you consider your body, that your whole body has got either a bone through the middle of the flesh to support the musculature, or a bone underneath the skin like the skull or the rib cage. But the only place where the body is not connected by a bony-like structure is from the bottom of the rib cage to the top of the pelvis. That's an articulating spine. That's where our viscera sits, and that whole area is controlled by musculature and fascia. All right, and if that fascia is not conditioned, if that musculature is not conditioned, or the athlete's insufficiently skilled, and the low back is too arched, or the pelvis is rotated forward, in other words, the bucket of the pelvis is pouring water out the front, all right, then that athlete, even though they are leaning from the ankles, they still don't have that advantage of the forward lean. So I look for connection, and in other words, a balance between the chest. If you consider the chest as an upside down bucket, on top of the pelvis as a bucket, that should be as little tilted forward or backward. So you don't want to be bending forward at the hips. That'll create over rotation. You don't want to be bending forward so much that your feet come in from behind you, and if you were running on gravel, you would kick stones forward. You want your foot coming straight down, But if you stopped applying power, you would continue going forward. So it's very simple analogy to look at somebody doing an acceleration or a stride or a run through, that when they want to slow down, what they do is they lift their shoulders up to slow down. So that's not what you want to be doing when you're running along at a constant pace. And then lastly, the faster you run, the more of this so-called forward lean you are able to sustain through centrifugal force. And so when you're running a lot slower, you'll obviously be a lot more upright.
Okay. Yeah, well, I think one of the biggest breakthroughs I remember taking a lesson with you was being in the military. I'm used to having my shoulders back, and you had to teach me. You had to teach me how to slouch when I run, like bad posture almost.
Exactly.
And that was a very clarifying moment with me. I think I spent 6 months focusing on having my shoulders rolled forward like Rocky when I was running, and I'm sure that's probably something a lot of athletes have because we've always been told to stand up straight.
Correct.